Portuguese citizenship. Is it still possible to apply for Portuguese citizenship? Has the law been cancelled? Or is it still in effect? All these are questions that people are asking today. And in this video, I'm going to try to make some order and explain in a very clear way, as much as possible, the risks that someone applying for Portuguese citizenship today is taking. Basically, in 2005, a law was passed in Portugal, following a similar law in Spain, to grant to descendants of Jews that were expelled from the Spanish Empire in the year 1492, Portuguese citizenship. So what happened in the year 1492? In the year 1492, Isabella, the queen, and her husband Fernando basically had an edict, an order to expel all the Jews from Spain. This order was expanded also to Portugal in 1497. And basically, if you research the map of the wandering of the expelled Jews, you will see that many of them went to very specific countries. And also they were expelled to many other countries all over the world. So there's basically a historical question: who today is a descendant of these expelled Jews in the world? Because the law in Portugal specifically says that the descendants of those expelled are entitled to Portuguese citizenship. And there are different ways to then define this as to who exactly is a descendant. The Portuguese government, and in the law basically, you see that the Portuguese government delegated the authority to two Jewish communities in Portugal to decide on this. So there's a Jewish community in Lisbon and there's the Jewish community in Porto. Both these Jewish communities have different worldviews on how to define a descendant of an expelled Jew. So Porto, for example, which is an Orthodox Jewish community, defines a descendant of an expelled Jew for the purpose of the law, because in their view, if Jews were expelled from Spain and Portugal, and if Portugal now wants to do justice and return the descendants of these expelled Jews, then they need to return Spanish Sephardic Jews to Portugal. So basically, according to the view of Porto, in order to be recognized as someone that's a descendant of expelled Jews from Spain, this person must be a Jew himself and a Sephardic Jew today. So basically, the way Porto works is that you need to prove that you're Jewish, and then you need to prove basically that you're a Sephardic Jew, and this is done mainly by the countries where you came from after the expulsion and before Israel became a state. That's when most of the Jews left those countries. Many of them came to Israel and others went to other countries like in North America and so on and so forth. But we're dealing mainly with North African countries like Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, and so on and so forth, and countries that were under the Ottoman Empire, like Turkey, Greece, Bulgaria, Macedonia, and countries in the Mediterranean coast, like Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt. So people that come from those countries usually will also have very specific surnames that only Jews from those countries had, and mostly the Jewish communities in those countries remain Sephardic, also culturally. So if you're from one of those countries, like your parents or grandparents, then the Jewish community in Porto will most likely give you a recommendation, a certificate, and with this certificate you can then apply for Portuguese citizenship. The Jewish community in Lisbon, on the other hand, recognizes anyone that's a descendant of Jews that were expelled from Spain, and their tests are more complicated because basically they don't only recognize Sephardic Jews that are Sephardic Jews today. In their view, anyone that's a descendant, regardless of whether they're Jewish or not today, should be able to return to Portugal. And actually, in numbers, you may have many more, even for sure, there are many more non-Jews that are descendants of these expelled Spanish Jews. And also after many of the Jews were expelled, those that didn't want to convert to Christianity and stay in the Spanish Empire, there were other waves of immigration outside of Spain after the Inquisition began, of second and third generation Jews in Spain that already became Christian but continued to practice Judaism for whatever reason, and then left, and you can find their descendants all over South America in the millions. And some really have clear proof. Some even have proof of protocols from the Vatican, where you see their great grandfather was interrogated on why he was circumcised and whether he's keeping various Jewish traditions. Anyway, you see the complexities here on how to even determine who's a descendant of an expelled Jew from Spain and Portugal. And because of the complexities, and also because we're dealing with huge numbers, and also because the amount of applications that were submitted were very high. Only in Israel you had 75,000 people that applied. All over the world we're dealing with numbers that are more than 150,000 people that applied, and most of these applications, based on the law, will most probably be approved. And because of the political environment, basically in Portugal, in 2022, regulations were enacted to make it more difficult to obtain Portuguese citizenship. These regulations basically determined that someone that applies doesn't only need to prove that he's a descendant of expelled Spanish Jews, but also that he has various connections to Portugal, like inheritance, like many visits ever since he was a child, and knowing the Portuguese language, and many other proofs of connection to Portugal. Another thing that happened during that time is that a very wealthy Jewish person called Roman Abramovich, that his background is from Ukraine, also got a certificate and was basically and applied for Portuguese citizenship. That made the news, and it made some political splash, and also because of that these regulations were enacted. As a result of these regulations, most of the law offices and companies that dealt with assisting people in applying for Portuguese citizenship basically shut their shops, and most of the applications ceased from being submitted. What happened though, after these regulations were enacted, is that many lawyers around Portugal started submitting Supreme Court petitions against these regulations, and 4 applications that were submitted after the regulations, arguing that these regulations aren't constitutional. Because the law of 2005 is a law, and a law has a higher authority than a regulation, the argument was that the regulations that contradict the law must be at the same level of a law. And what happened was, following all these petitions, the government of Portugal submitted a draft law, basically taking these regulations and the limitations to being eligible for Portuguese citizenship, and giving these regulations the same authority of a law. So right now there is a draft law that was submitted following the Supreme Court petitions that were submitted in Portugal. And what this means is that basically even the respondent to these petitions agrees that the regulations are problematic, because if he didn't agree the regulations were problematic, he wouldn't have submitted the draft law. And if I were a judge in the Supreme Court in Portugal, I would ask the respondent, so it seems like you agree with the petitions, because if you think the regulations are enough and are constitutional, there's no reason to submit this draft law. Now we're waiting for this draft law to be approved, and we're waiting for determinations to be made by the Supreme Court in Portugal regarding all the petitions that were submitted. But all the experts right now are of the opinion that these regulations are unconstitutional, and that all the applications that have been submitted and will be submitted until the draft law becomes a law will basically be dealt with based on the original law of 2005 without the limitations. So this is the situation right now as it relates to submitting applications for Portuguese citizenship. And this is the risk that anyone that wants to submit an application will be taking. I hope that this information was clear and this video was helpful. If you have any further questions, please feel free to contact us. Thank you for your time.